All right, hi gang. We, for this section of campaigns and elections, are going to look at modern presidential elections. Modern meaning roughly 1928 till today-ish. One of the things we'll notice during these elections are something called political realignments. All right. During political realignments, what we often see is regional shifts in the political culture. New and different political coalitions will be formed. The Revolutionary War is a good example. You had this alliance that was keeping America with Britain between the royalists, the merchants, and the southern plantation owners, right? After the Boston Tea Party, the British response started to break up that alliance of royalists, merchants, and southern plantation owners. The merchants and the plantation owners switched to being more aligned with the radical elements of the colonies, the day laborers, the artisans, small farmers, shopkeepers, things like that. That's the type of political realignment we're sort of talking about, and a major political realignment happened in 1932, and it's very significant. See it very obviously in the presidential election. If you look over here is a graph from the textbook that has the stable periods of American politics punctuated by these political realignments. Think of political realignments as a golf ball. The golf ball sitting there on the tee, it's very stable, right? It's not moving, it's not going anywhere, it's not moving, it's just sort of sitting there on the tee being all stable and whatnot. Then someone comes along with a golf club and hits it. All of a sudden that golf ball goes from being stable to flying all over the place away. Its placement in the world gets very shooken up, right? And then the golf ball hits ground, rolls a little bit, and then stops and is stable again. And it's stable again for a long period of time until somebody comes over and hits it again. Political realignments are often kind of the same thing. The positions of the political parties, the populations among the American public that they get their support from will be stable for a long period of time, and then you may have something that shakes up that balance for a period of a couple of years, 2 election cycles, maybe something like that, and then a new norm settles in, and that new norm may settle in for several decades. And I think you see that with the graph over there. Okay, we're going to start looking at the okay, before we start looking at the modern presidential elections, to give you a sense of how the elections have changed over the past, or the political climate has changed over the past 80 years. Math off the top of my head. 80 years. A very broad overview, or a very broad message, picture, whatever. This country has gone from being extremely liberal from the 1932, at least on economic issues, role of the government, and things like that. 1932 until about 1968 to 1976 is when that sort of realignment, I would say, really started to take place, and then it sort of settled in with Carter, and we have a new pretty significant swing to the right. Obama, for example, I said he is a more conservative president on a lot of issues than Richard Nixon, a Republican from the 68 to 74. Obama isn't a giant bigot like Richard Nixon is, certainly more progressive on social issues, but economic issues, Richard Nixon's the Republican president that created the EPA, pushed for a very liberal universal health care plan, things like that, blah, blah, blah. The rightward shift in this country has been so complete that we even see a return to the economic government policies of the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, and 1920s, which famously were the days of big monopolies, robber barons, and the economic policies that led to us having a depression about once every 20 years, culminating in the Great Depression of 1929. So we'll start with 1928. Okay, let's get started with the 1928 election. The 1928 election was between Herbert Hoover, Republican, and Al Smith, Democrat. This was the last election, 1928, where you saw Republicans really dominating the election cycle for a long time. It came again, but this was the sort of end of the initial Republican golden era. One thing I want you to notice is look at those southern states. There's something known as the Solid South. This South has been very solid in terms of who it votes for. It goes either for one party or the other. You don't very often see southern states get all broken up. One key thing about this election, Al Smith, the Democrat, had the unfortunate handicap of being Catholic in the 1920s and in America, and the anti-Catholic bigotry on display during the presidential campaign was kind of a big deal. The anti-Catholic bigotry is even a bigger deal when you consider that the Solid South decided they would rather vote for a Catholic than a member of the party of Lincoln. Look how solidly Al Smith carried the South and how solidly Herbert Hoover carried the rest of the country. You would expect the South to be a little more anti-Catholic than it ended up being, but Southerners hated Lincoln more than they hated Catholics. Okay, let's zoom through 1932 to 1944. So 1929, the stock market crashes and we have the beginning of the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover, like a good free market Republican, doesn't do anything. He just sort of sits back. Free market will work itself out. Can't regulate business. Government can't get involved in doing anything. And as we talked about in the federalism section, the states were completely unable to respond to the crisis. So 1932 comes along, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt wins the first of his 4 straight presidential elections. He wins the first one against Herbert Hoover by a ridiculous margin. He destroys Mr. Hoover. In 1936, the Great Depression is not over, but Roosevelt is extremely popular. He's put in government programs that are getting people food, that are giving people jobs, that are starting to get things turned around. It's just once you are in a hole that deep, it takes a long time to get out of it. The Republicans put up Alf Landon against Roosevelt, and Landon gets, again, destroyed completely by Roosevelt. In 1940, we're really coming out of the Depression, but now we got a war going on where, Europe's fighting into war, Roosevelt's sort of angling us to get involved, and the people still like Roosevelt, don't necessarily want to change, captains mid-voyage or whatever, if you know what I mean. Don't change bus drivers while the bus is still driving, and this American bus was certainly driving towards a recovery and possibly towards war with the Nazis. So, Roosevelt and W.W. Wendell Willkie have at it in 1940. The margin of victory for Roosevelt is considerably smaller than 32 or 36. Part of this would be because things are getting better, which is a little weird, I know. Part of this would be because Roosevelt's now running for his third term, and we hadn't had a president do that. Well, Teddy did, the other Roosevelt. But people felt weird electing to win a third term president. He won nonetheless. December 7th, 1941, Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. 1944 rolls around, and it's Thomas Dewey, Republican, against Franklin Roosevelt, Democrat. Where in the tail end of World War II, still at war though, and Roosevelt's still popular, and people don't necessarily want to change presidents in the middle of a gigantic world war. So Roosevelt's reelected a fourth time, with a commanding solid majority. His running mate, Roosevelt's running mate during 1944, is Harry Truman. This becomes very important for the 1948 election. But real quick backtrack, during the Great Depression, this is when Roosevelt signed into law with massive Democratic majorities that got swept in with him. Social Security, unemployment, Medicare, a lot of the alphabet soup agencies, one of the more famous ones, Tennessee Valley Authority, brought electricity and plumbing to the people of the Appalachian Mountains, where the governments were too poor and the free market didn't care enough to provide electricity to such poor people. The Democratic winning control of the House in 1932, they would not lose control of the House of Representatives until 1994. They would lose control of the Senate once or twice, but not for very long. During that time, 1932 began an era of complete and utter Democratic dominance of the Congress. Okay, 1948 is a super awesome election. I love to talk about it, but I'll try and make a long story short. Truman becomes president. Harry Truman becomes president after Roosevelt dies in 1945. Truman's president until 1948. He runs for the Democratic nomination again, and he wins it, however, not before controversy. At the 1948 Democratic National Convention, when they were writing up the party's platform, just like when the Democrats in 2012 wrote up their party platform and forgot to include God and Jerusalem and whatnot, the Democrats included something kind of interesting in this 1948 platform. It was a official statement in favor of integration, the end of segregation, and of civil rights for all people. The Southern Democrats were livid about this. The Southern Democrats led a walkout at the convention, just left. They formed their own party very quickly, the Dixiecrats. Strom Thurmond, who would be elected senator, who was the senator of South Carolina, and who would continue to be elected senator until he died at 102 years old. Strom Thurmond was the Dixiecrat candidate in 1948, and he won several southern states. This would seem to set up a great opportunity for the Republicans to come in and reclaim the White House. However, Truman is not a super likable guy, but he runs on this fiercely called Fair Deal platform. It's like New Deal on steroids. He essentially runs on government health insurance, expanded Social Security and social safety net, more paid leave, things like that. And despite all predictions to the contrary, narrowly comes from behind and defeats Thomas Dewey. After 48 comes 52. 1952, or as I will call it, as I just made up right now, the year the Socialists won the White House. Dwight Eisenhower, Republican, defeats Adlai Stevenson in 1952 and 1956. It's a rematch in 1956, and the Republican wins again. Dwight Eisenhower is a war hero coming out of World War II, and the Soviet Union's exploding nuclear bombs, and it's super scary. And so why not have a real live general in the White House? In addition to that, Eisenhower is, as I said, the year of the socialists. Puts in a lot of, continues and expands a lot of FDR's and Harry Truman's programs. Builds the interstate highway system. Think of it today, we can't get people to simply maintain our roads and our bridges. Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, institutes this massive new building program to expand the interstate, to create and expand interstate highway system all across the nation. That kind of government spending project would be unthinkable today. You think the healthcare law is expensive? Holy cow. So Eisenhower wins both those elections, and America has its maybe closest flirtation with socialism outside of LBJ. Okay, so in 1960, John F. Kennedy beat Richard Nixon just barely. John F. Kennedy's a Catholic, and John F. Kennedy's a Catholic, and he has to assure America that he will not take orders from the Pope while he is president. He barely wins in part because the American people are wary that the Catholic president will feel obligated to take orders from the Pope. Mitt Romney, unfortunately, had to give a similar speech talking about how his Mormonism was not going to make him the worst president of all time. His policies were going to make him the worst president of all time, not his religion, though. Okay, so sorry. But nobody else cares about the rest of JFK. What's interesting is 1964, Lyndon Baines Johnson wins re-election by a gigantic, huge margin with gigantic Democratic majorities. This guy, Barry Goldwater from Arizona, runs on what we would consider today to be a conservative Republican ticket. In 1964, he is a freaking nut job. Nobody takes him seriously. They think he is crazy. Right? This guy's economic policies are freaking insane to people who just had the Great Depression coming out of their rear view mirror there. Today, Barry Goldwater Institute is a thriving, conservative, pseudo-libertarian type think tank, which a lot of members of Congress think is a great thing. But he was laughable at the time. I mean, and this election shows that New Deal economics have won. Americans are liberal economics people. They support government intervention in the economy, social safety net, blah, blah, blah. With the caveat, you'll notice one little thing. That solid South that had been going Democrat for so long, precisely because of that economic policy, all of a sudden switches to Barry Goldwater. Because Barry Goldwater, while not necessarily I'll say this, Barry Goldwater is a moderate when it comes to race for his time. However, he uses racial messages to his great advantage and is able to win the South. When he talks about how he's going to take everybody's Social Security checks and destroy Medicare and unemployment insurance, blah, 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 people in the South are throwing tomatoes at him, jeering him. You got to give it to Barry Goldwater for saying what he believed to people who, again, thought he was fucking nuts. All right. And yet, when it came down to it, Barry Goldwater also said, and by the way, states' rights, you guys want to keep black people out of your hotels and out of your restaurants and schools? I ain't going to stop you. I'm the guy. I'm going to take away your Social Security check. I'm going to take away your unemployment. I'm going to take away your health insurance. But I'm going to make sure black people don't sit next to you. And the South completely abandoned their own economic self-interest to vote with the guy with the racist campaign. It's a huge turning point in American politics. Okay, so this brings us to the elections of 1968 and 1972. Richard Nixon wins both of them. In 1968, another Democrat, actually, George Wallace, runs as an American independent. George Wallace is the governor of Alabama, former governor of Alabama, who famously stood in front of a schoolhouse to prevent little black children from entering into the all-white school. He got so many love letters for it. It was embarrassing for the nation. That was actually really crucial, because what happened was George Wallace got a lot of those letters, and he got a lot of those letters, love letters, from the North. And Nixon said, you know what? Maybe if I'm a big racist, I can actually win some southern states, and it would also play well in the North. And sure enough, that's what happened. 1968, Nixon figured out how to put on makeup. It's a story of this 1960 campaign against Kennedy. Don't worry about it. Anyway, Nixon put on some makeup and was able to beat Hubert Humphrey. Nixon promised to get us out of Vietnam, which he promptly did after or before resigning the White House. In 1972, things are going pretty well. Nixon runs against Peacenik and is able to kick his butt. George McGovern. including those southern states, and that helps sort of cement this political realignment, with the exception of Jimmy Carter, which we'll see in a second. So you might have heard Richard Nixon was a little corrupt, and the nation was a little sad that they voted for him twice and in large majorities, at least that second time. So the nation, as one does after it sins, finds Jesus in the form of a born-again Southern pastor, Baptist minister dude, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is super pious, super religious, basically the opposite of Nixon. And good thing for the Democrats, he's a Democrat from Georgia. Now, Jimmy Carter is certainly not a racist, but he's got a certain bit of cred with the South because he's from the South. And he's able to go around the South and then to the North and talk about how neighborhoods, if you want to have a Czechoslovakian neighborhood, you should be able to have a Czechoslovakian neighborhood, or a Korean neighborhood, you should be able to have a Korean neighborhood, or ... everybody knows a white neighborhood, you can have a white neighborhood. He's able to win an election. And the nation likes that they found Jesus, but 4 years later with Reagan, they find they like conservative Jesus a lot better than liberal Jesus. So elections in 1980, 1984, and 1988. Ronald Reagan, he's a great actor. He was a good enough actor to be super charming and win the presidency. When Ronald Reagan ran in 1980 and 1984, he was everybody's grandfather, very charismatic. He loved Jesus just as much as Jimmy Carter, but he also said things about law and order and putting young bucks in jail. I wonder who he could have been referring to. Young bucks was a term for black men. So Ronald Reagan was telling America that he was going to put black men in jail. And he won. Hooray. So Ronald Reagan talks about the law and order problem that we have in America. He talks about the welfare queen, which then also has a black face to it. It's a black woman who has a lot of kids. The welfare queen in Chicago who has 80 social security numbers and picks up $15,000 a week or something ridiculous like that from the government and blah blah blah. He made this woman up 100% out of whole cloth. Never existed. Completely fabricated example. But for some reason it just kept getting reported as truth. Like, look, there are these people out there that take advantage of the system and we need to chop down on them. So Reagan's got the look, he feels like a granddad, America loves him and elects him twice. And then George H.W. Bush, his vice president, and George W. Bush's father runs in 1988 and wins the election against Michael Dukakis. Michael Dukakis, if you look on the PowerPoint slides, had an unfortunate picture taken of him in a tank with this oversized helmet on. Really, these, especially 84 and 88, weren't fair fights. Democrats, it was kind of like Obama and John McCain. Even if there wasn't a financial crisis, you know Obama's going to beat the crap out of John McCain. He just talked way too pretty. Reagan had the same thing going on, and there wasn't a Democrat that could match that. So yeah, 80, 84, pretty decent Republican victories. 88. So you can see, pretty good Republican victory. So in 1992, Bill Clinton becomes one of the luckiest people in the world. He happens to run for president right when there's a little bit of a recession going on. George H.W. Bush is an extremely popular president and popular person going into 1991, but then the economy kind of takes a little tumble, and Clinton comes on to the stage from Arkansas and feels your pain, and beats George H.W. Bush with a little bit of help from an eccentric billionaire, Ross Perot, in 1992. Bill Clinton is also extremely fortunate in that he is the beneficiary of 40 years of government investment and public sector research really pays off for him in the with the internet. The GI Bill, getting people educated, coming back from World War II. All that government investment into infrastructure and research and science and technology to combat the Soviets really starts to pay off in 1993, 1994, 1995, 96 with the internet stock bubble. In 1996, he beats Bob Dole, old school Republican, for president as well. One of the things about Clinton, he's a very right-wing leaning Democrat. He's this third-way centrist new Democrat that's more conservative than anything else. He, for example, signs the welfare reform law and boasts about the fact that he got more Americans off welfare than anybody else whatever did. And he didn't do that by making the economy great. He did that by changing the law so that less people qualified for it. It's kind of like saying, I successfully moved 1 million people out of a flood zone because I redrew where the flood zone lines were, so that 1 million people were now outside of those lines. This leads us to the saddest election. So in no way misunderstand me. George W. Bush won the 2000 election legally. He did not win the popular vote, and he did not win Florida if you count the votes. But within the letter of the law, at least the letter of the law as interpreted by the Supreme Court, and of course the Supreme Court is the final law of the land, George Bush won the 2000 election. George Bush runs as a compassionate conservative, somebody who's an isolationist, not a nation builder around the world. He pretty much has to run this campaign that he really cares about everybody else because the Democrats have done a very good job cornering the market on that. George Bush is a lot more personable than Al Gore. Al Gore's got this little bit of a robotic feature to him, and George Bush is able to connect with the American people more, sort of accent the vision of an American dream, a very pious, conservative nation that everybody else sort of looks up to. And people are able to gravitate towards it. He's able to get enough votes to plausibly win the election. George Bush faces John Kerry in 2004. John Kerry gets swift voted. It's a term we use now to refer to a candidate who has an ad run against them that's super malicious and 100% wrong. There's this group, Swift Vote Veterans for Truth, the Political Action Committee, that really sort of gave us a lens into the future of what campaigns will hold in the future. They called into question John Kerry's war record as John Kerry himself reported it, and as the military documents reported John Kerry's war record. And we all found out it was 100% BS. The Swift Vote Veterans for Truth claims were BS. So George W. Bush wins in 2004, this time pretty legitimately. There's some concern in Ohio, wouldn't have changed the election, but it showed the problem that our election system, I think, has in Ohio. In 2004, there were still 100 or 200,000 people waiting in line at about midnight or so, trying to vote. 40 degrees and raining outside. People shouldn't be in line waiting to vote for 8 hours in 40 degrees and rain. So in a lot of ways, I feel bad for Bush because there's a little bit of a cloud hanging over both of his elections. The 2001 is legitimate. The 2004 is not quite as legitimate. Not legitimate at all, I should say. And this brings us to the last two presidential elections in which Barack Obama has won. Both of them. As he reminded Republicans at the last State of the Union address. It was very funny. In 2008, Obama's election was very similar to FDR's in 1932. You had a Republican in office who was facing a extremely severe recession and kind of not doing much about it. The recession started in late 2007. Americans started losing their jobs in June 2007, July 2007. I have the jobs report right here. Was it July 2007? 34,000 jobs were lost. Then 17,000 in August. We see a little bit of a rebound going into Christmas, but then by February 2008, 87,000, 79,000, and in April, 213,000 jobs lost, 183,000 jobs lost. August 2008, 259,000 jobs lost. November 2008, 765,000 jobs lost. It was ridiculous. The only thing that kept it from getting really bad were the reforms put in place because of the 1932 depression. Unemployment benefits, certain Social Security programs and welfare kicked in to help, if you can call losing 700,000 jobs a month stabilizing the economy. Stabilize the economy. Obama got into office with a bunch of Democrats, and they were able to pass a stimulus bill that probably was, in the end, not big enough to create any quicker change, but it was kind of the best compromise they could do. So the 2008 election was really all about the Bush scandals of the previous 2 years and about the bottom falling out of the economy right at the wrong time for John McCain. It took a Obama victory, a slimmish Obama victory, to a victory where Obama wins a state like Indiana. That's what the 2008 economic fallout did for that election. Going into the November 2012 election, things were actually looking pretty good. They didn't feel good because there was such a big hole to begin with. Lots of very interesting economic detail, but I won't go into it. I'll just say that in the 2012 election, the economy was a big focal point. There was the claim that the economy wasn't doing very well, that the president's policies had failed. Whether or not they failed or not, or they did anything good, the fact is, in 2012, out of the 12 months of 2012, only 2 months showed job growth under 100,000 jobs, and 5 of the 12 months showed job growth over 200,000 jobs a month. Since the beginning of 2013, I think we've seen something like 220 to 250,000 jobs on average a month being created. The other big issue of 2012 was the fact that Mitt Romney was super duper rich and just couldn't seem to connect with anybody. He just showed a pretty disgusting lack of empathy, an unawareness of what the average American was going through. It's not to say he's not a swell guy, or he wouldn't have had the answers to what ails the country. Just the fact of the matter is he was completely oblivious to what was appropriate to say and what was not appropriate to say. And so Obama was able to beat him pretty handedly as well. It's 2012. 2016 will be interesting. Hillary apparently has already won, but Hillary already won in 2008 also. So we'll see what happens.